It is a lovely Saturday. I am here in my Brooklyn apartment, and you all are joining me, and we are about to have an amazing live. It's a peaceful day. It's a happy day. It was a little bit warmer earlier. It's a little bit windier outside here in Brooklyn, but I'm happy, and so are you. And you're all joining me, and I'm so happy, and there are so many things we can discuss today. Now, if you all hold for just 1 second, I have to make a quick adjustment of setting. Here I am. Welcome, welcome. Wow, just making sure everything's in order today. What a lovely day. So much to discuss. Maria Gens says, finally caught your live. Well, here you are, Maria. And there's plenty to talk about. Now, I know you all probably have topics you want me to address, and as I see them, I am going to write them down so I get to them. Mr. Bigger says, hey, Caleb. Well, hey to you, Mr. Bigger. Glad we're talking. I'm opening the beverage that will not be named and pouring it, so I have plenty of energy. Kazuya says he wants me to talk about Iran, and yes, I will talk about Iran. Plenty to talk about regarding Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran, Iraq, that's the American way, that's how we said it when I was a kid, but we all know it's Iran, and people who live there are Irani, and it's Iran, not Iraq, or not Iraq. Not Iraq, not Iran. The pronunciation's there. But hey, for those of you who are with us here as we get going here on our Saturday live conversation, please get on your Twitter, get on your Facebook, and share. Promote this. Make this a bigger conversation. The more, the merrier. The more of you that are here, the more I'll have to say. The more people that join us, the more views. The bigger this conversation gets, the more exciting it will be. I love you all, but I want there to be more of you. And by the way, shout out to my lurkers. I love you, lurkers. You're allowed to lurk. Shout out to J24. Hi, back to you. But lurkers, you're allowed to lurk. If you don't feel like making a comment, no obligation here. We're part of a community, and the lurker population on these videos and on these lives is pretty big. Shout out to Andy. Hi, Andy. How are you? A lot of people are watching but not saying anything, and that's perfectly fine. I think I understand why that might be. You don't necessarily want the blowback of being part of this, and that's okay. Tulsano says, lurker here. Well, you're not a lurker anymore, Tulsano. You just spoke. But, there's plenty we can talk about. And Venezuela, the triumph of the lurking class, says Swine Class. Well, hey, we're all triumphant here on this lovely Saturday afternoon with so much to discuss. I've got a lot to go over, a lot to engage with you all about. It's going to be a great afternoon. Andy also wants me to talk about Iran, and I will be talking about Iran. Do not worry. I will be discussing Iran. Plenty to talk about when it comes to Iran. Plenty of developments. But what else is new? What's on folks' minds? Tweet this out, share this. I wanted to also mention, and this is just kind of a business thing. This isn't a big political thing. This is related to our chats here. Strange stuff happening on that subscriber count, right? A lot of people are messaging me that they're subscribers, they're subscribed, but they're not getting notices of these lives. That's interesting. So if you're a subscriber, you may want to check back. Make sure, because not everyone's getting these lives showing up in their news feeds for some reason. Shout out to Eve joining us from out in Colorado. Welcome. So if there's some weird stuff going on in your live count, and also make sure that you're subscribed, right? If you're subscribed, you should be getting a notice that these lives are happening so you can be part of the conversation. So much to talk about today. Someone's asking me what I think of Theresa May stepping down. Someone's asking me about the Trump administration. Did they go insane? Well, we'll get to that, so certainly. Someone's asking me to talk about Modi. Someone's asking me if I'm familiar with the Marxist writer from Egypt, Samir Amin. A lot of questions being thrown at me, and a lot that I will be happy to talk about. So be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to make this a bigger conversation as we get going. A lot to talk about. I'm going to slightly adjust us there. There we go. And I am going to take a sip of the beverage that will not be named. And I'm going to pour some more of it now that I've waited for the fizz to go down. And we're going to talk about so many issues that need to be discussed. And like I said, tweet this out, share it, invite more people to join, post on your wall and say, hey, let's ask Caleb about whatever, and get all your friends here asking me about the topic. I won't be able to ignore it, right? That's what they all say. The more people involved, the more people asking your questions. So Kim, North Korea cancels all talks with the U.S., says Kazuya. Wants to ask me what that's about. There you go. So a lot of geopolitical questions I'm getting asked about. Iran, Venezuela. A lot to go over. A lot of things that people want me to discuss. I will say it's a beautiful day here in Brooklyn. It really is a beautiful day. But there you go. Caleb, congratulate my football team, the Glasgow Celtics. Just won treble 9 cups in 3 years straight, says Richity the Fork. I don't follow soccer or football as they call it, but congratulations if your football team is doing well. If your soccer team is doing well, that's great. Congratulations to you. I played soccer for 1 season as a high school student. Not the best experience of my life. However, after that, I became a sports announcer. And that was very enjoyable. I would announce the soccer games. I actually got paid. It was a part-time, small job I did in high school. I was a sports announcer, and that was fun. There you go. What else is going on? Now, Tornado Nick says, hey, Caleb, how's your week been? It's been a good week. It's summertime here in New York City. I'll say that much. It's summertime. We're all enjoying ourselves. So much to discuss. So why don't we get into the topic I've been asked about several times already, and we're only 6 minutes into the live. Let's talk about Iran. Now, the Trump administration has confirmed that they are indeed considering an escalation of the U.S. military presence in the Middle East, and there are already rumors going around, and it's not totally confirmed that they're on their way yet, but it seems like there is an escalation of U.S. military presence in the Middle East in response to alleged threats from Iran. Now, what are these threats to the United States in Iran? Well, they are alleging that there are missiles on top of boats, that Iran has put missiles on their boats, and that this is a threat to the United States, and so the United States must escalate its presence in the Middle East. Well, folks, if you think that Iran is putting missiles on their boats to randomly attack U.S. forces for absolutely no reason, you're a little bit out to lunch. I can say that much. Right now, the U.S. government has ripped apart, as Trump put it, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the P5+1 nuclear conclusion. Iran gave up the overwhelming majority of its peaceful nuclear energy program when the nuclear deal was signed. They agreed to have the International Atomic Energy Agency inspect all of their nuclear sites, and they basically gave up their peaceful nuclear energy program. Now, they already had the IAEA as members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, observing all their nuclear sites. They had never violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty, had never taken any concrete step toward developing a nuclear bomb. And that's something you won't hear in the media. The media makes it sound like the only reason Iran had nuclear energy was, they wanted to develop an atomic bomb. They kind of joke, as if, oh, ha, ha, ha. Everyone knows Iran was trying to get a nuclear bomb, and they weren't trying to get a nuclear bomb. And the IAEA confirmed that. But regardless, the nuclear deal that was signed, as a result of, John Kerry in Sweden, and the P5+1 talks, and Geneva, and all of that, the ultimate result of all of that stuff was a nuclear deal in which Iran gave up its peaceful nuclear energy program, the overwhelming majority of it. They kept a little bit of it, but overwhelmingly, they got rid of it. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which was already there, began monitoring to make sure they complied with the nuclear deal, and in exchange, sanctions were to be lifted against Iran. And the Trump administration came in and ripped that up completely. Iran had already shut down so much of its peaceful nuclear energy program, but now the sanctions have been reimposed. Trump said that Iran was not fulfilling the spirit of the agreement. He didn't say they were violating the agreement because they weren't. In the International Atomic Energy Agency, European countries all confirmed that Iran was fully complying with the deal. That didn't stop the Trump administration from ripping it up, and they said that it was a bad deal to begin with, even if Iran was complying. So Iran has waited and waited, and under the agreements, because Iran was facing new sanctions, and the USA violated the deal, the European countries were expected to then compensate Iran for the fact that the USA pulled out of the deal. Well, the European countries haven't done that. So Iran is basically not going to comply with the deal anymore. They've pulled out of the deal as well, right? If the USA was going to not sanction them in exchange for them giving up their peaceful nuclear energy program, why should they give up their peaceful nuclear energy program if they're not getting the benefit, what was promised to them as a result of the nuclear deal? So, as a result, Iran is expanding its peaceful nuclear energy program. And furthermore, we now have the Trump administration announcing that they are going to stop Iran from exporting oil. Iran's entire economy is centered around a state-run oil company. It's an oil-rich country, has been, and so they announced that they're intending to bring Iran's oil exports down to zero. Iran is facing economic strangulation, right? Of course, they're very concerned that at some point the USA may try to stop an oil tanker. A number of countries have announced they're going to ignore the United States and keep buying Iranian oil, among them China. China is going to keep buying Iranian oil. And so Iran has, put some missiles and put some rockets on their boats in the case of the understanding that maybe perhaps the USA might try to stop one of their oil tankers or mess with them in the Straits of Hormuz or in the Persian Gulf. And so now it's announced by the Trump administration that these are threats against the United States. They're threatening to attack U.S. forces, so now there's an escalation. And there are reports that the USA, the Trump administration, was considering an attack on Iran, and now the White House has denied those reports, and there seems to be some confusion. We have Bernie Sanders coming out and saying he will not allow the USA to go to war with Iran, that this will be stopped. We have Mike Pompeo and Patrick Shanahan, the acting head of the U.S. Central Command, going to Capitol Hill, meeting with congressional leaders behind closed doors and talking about threats from Iran, briefing them on the situation regarding Iran. The whole situation is very, very dangerous, and it has the danger to escalate. And as someone from the United States who has spent quite a bit of time in Iran, attended conferences in Iran, made a documentary about Iran, participated in a humanitarian mission with Iranian medical volunteers trying to bring humanitarian aid to Yemen, I feel like, compared to most Americans, I have more of kind of an understanding of the situation going on over there. And that's why this whole thing has got me deeply worried, because I know that the Iranian people are going to defend their country. That country is locked and loaded. They have got Basij councils, and they have got, the Revolutionary Guards, and they have got militias, and this is not going to be, fighting Iran is not a joke. It's not a joke at all. I tell people about, after I got back from my humanitarian mission, and trying to bring medical aid to Yemen, we went to the shrine where Khomeini, the founder of the revolution of Iran, is buried. And it was on the anniversary of his death. And I was at the shrine, the Khomeini shrine, for a ceremony that they have every year to commemorate the death of Khomeini, in which the supreme leader, the successor of Khomeini, Khamenei, Ali Syed Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, spoke. And that was a very moving experience. There were roughly 20,000 people inside of that mausoleum. I was, seated with the foreigners and diplomats. There were a lot of African diplomats, a lot of Chinese diplomats, Chinese businessmen in this section I was in. But most of the 20,000 people that were in this auditorium were everyday Iranian working class people who would bust in on these tiny little buses from all over the country, teenagers, young people, military folks, Revolutionary Guards, all packed into this auditorium. It was kind of funny because, I being the only American in that auditorium of 20,000 people, when I went in, I got the pat down of my life. I have never been so thoroughly checked for weapons and patted down as I was when I was the only American to go into the auditorium, the mausoleum, to see the supreme leader of Iran. They took my wallet out and they checked every single one of my credit cards and membership cards and business cards in my wallet to make sure they weren't knives, they weren't sharpened. They went through all the pockets of my pants. I got the thorough pat down, because here I am, an American, about to go into the auditorium where the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran is going to give a speech. That was quite an experience. I went into the auditorium. They gave me an earpiece with translation so I could hear the Supreme Leader speak. And I was towards the front, and I was on the side. It's divided between men and women. Women are on one side, men are on the other side. And I was about 100 feet away from the Supreme Leader. But he was up on a balcony. I was on the ground level, and he was up on like a balcony. And I gotta tell you, you can't really understand it unless you were there. But when the Supreme Leader, Ali Syed Khamenei, came out onto the balcony, uh, the energy, the level of energy in that room was, whoo! I mean, it was like the room had been lit up with electricity. It was like a jolt, like the room just shook, right? I mean, it was like the minute before he was there, the level of energy was at one place in the room, and then the level of energy went up, doubled, tripled in the room. It was like the room was like alive all of a sudden. And you had people crying as soon as they saw the Supreme Leader, just crying, bursting into tears. Grown men just bursting into tears as soon as they see the Supreme Leader. People moving back and forth. All the men, when he enters the room, the different men, they extend their hands and they say, "The blood in my vessels belongs to the Supreme Leader." And it was quite a moment when the Supreme Leader of Iran walks into this auditorium. It's like something you can't really describe it, right? It was a unique experience, and he spoke. He gave a presentation, which I heard the presentation. I heard the English simultaneous translation that was going on. Very interesting. He talked about Iran's history, and the Islamic Revolution. And he was addressing some current disagreements within Iran itself. He talked about how, they do refer to the United States as the Great Satan, even though they are not referring to the people of the United States. They're referring to the imperialist system based in the United States. He talked about, in his remarks, he spoke about how he felt like ISIS was a distortion of Islam, and that the ISIS terrorists do not represent Islam. They are murderers, he talked against ISIS quite a bit. He also spoke against westernized Islam, and westernized Islam that supports American capitalism, Islam that supports the Western imperialist system, and he spoke against that, and he argued that Iran is putting into practice the true Islamic system by rejecting both terrorist jihadism and westernized Islam. They were the true interpretation. He called for a need for unity of Sunnis and Shias, and how the ISIS terrorists were trying to play Sunnis against Shias. He talked about how the Islamic Revolution was not like the Marxist revolutions of Europe, and it was not like the French Revolution, because while there was violence, it was not glorifying killing, and he argued that the French Revolution and the Marxist revolutions overemphasized killing too much. What else did he say? He talked about police brutality in the United States. He said that they condemn the crimes of ISIS terrorism as well as the crimes of police brutality in the USA. What else did he talk about? He talked about a lot of different things. He just spoke about the need, how Iran rejects capitalism, even though they're not a socialist country. He spoke about how, capitalism, it violates the Islamic way, but they're not a socialist country, he argued, because socialism is a Western concept, it's Marxist and all that. And he said that the Islamic system is where the religious leaders guide the economic and political system. It was quite an interesting presentation. And at the time, and still today, there's big divisions in Iran between what they call the reformist movement, which then the people who don't like them call them the moderates, and the hardliners, which that's what people who don't like them call themselves. They call themselves the principalists, right? And these two factions, the hardliners / principalists, the moderates / reformists, they are the two wings. And that the Supreme Leader of Iran, interestingly, rejects both. And he says that every Muslim is both a reformer and a principalist. You stick to your principles, but you're open to reform. And that the Supreme Leader doesn't take sides in these factions. And that the elections, they tend to elect, the current leader of Iran, the president, Rouhani, is considered to be a reformist or a moderate. Whereas his predecessor, Ahmadinejad is considered to be a hardliner or a principalist. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting, the Iranian political situation. So there you go. And I spent a lot of time in the country, and I got to tell you that there are a lot of Iranians who are frustrated about the situation in the country. They want reform, and I think that everyone agrees that reform on some level is needed. There are issues with human rights. There are issues with the economic system. The gap between the rich and poor has been rising lately in Iran, and that that some of the free market more market sector reforms that have been implemented by Rouhani have infuriated people. They argue that he's given too much freedom to the banking sector. However, there are other people on the reformist side who argue that they need to open up more in terms of what kind of music and art that they allow, and that they shouldn't be so strict in that term. They should loosen some of the social legislation. There's widespread disagreement within Iran. The Iranian people, they debate politics. When I was on the streets of Iran making this documentary I made, I talked to Iranians. There were Iranians who told me they hated Rouhani, that he was a sellout and a phony and a traitor. There were Iranians who told me they hated Ahmadinejad and that he'd hurt Iran with his hardline extreme policies. I heard all kinds of disagreement on the streets of Iran. There were many, many different perspectives. This idea that Iran is a totalitarian state where no one's allowed to say anything or they get disappeared in the middle of the night and killed is a bunch of malarkey. Now, do they have the level of free speech we have in the West? Of course not, and I'm not saying that, right? I don't... as a country that they are, that is fighting for its life with extremists, they've got, terrorist gangs on their Afghan border and Sunni jihadist separatists. They've got other, forces on their Iraqi border trying to come in there and tear them up. They've got the jihadist forces in Syria trying to come in there. Iran is, a country that is basically fighting for its life, and it's probably one of the most stable countries in the Middle East at this point. They don't have terrorist attacks there. They don't have bombings, but in order to keep it that way, they have developed a much more authoritarian political model. And, Iranian diplomats, Iranian government officials are the first to tell you they would like that to change. They would like to move to having a higher level of civil liberties and more human rights than they have now. However, when you're fighting for your life, when you're facing terrorists and drug dealers, Iran has a huge problem with heroin coming over the border from Afghanistan. Iran's the number of heroin addicts in Iran is not small. It's one of the largest percentages in the world, and that's because they're right on the border with Afghanistan, with drug cartels coming in. They have real difficulties there in Iran, but they're trying to maintain their non-capitalist economy. They call it, not capitalism, but Islam. The revolution was founded on a principle of neither East nor West. They were neither, Soviet-style communism nor Western capitalism. They talked about how the revolution was a war of poverty against wealth. And then they have these organizations called the Basij. And they're like community councils that exist in every neighborhood. And Basij literally means... the mobilized oppressed, and that's what Basij means. And in every neighborhood in Iran, you have your Basij, and they are the people that their job it is to promote the goals of the revolution and to carry out the agenda of the supreme leader. Now, the biggest economic entity in Iran at this point is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a military force which is above the elected government. It is accountable only to the supreme leader. And, it's military, but it also does a lot of infrastructure. They build Iran's bridges, for example. They build Iran's power plants, and they're kind of a collective or a giant religious cooperative, you could call it. And the Trump administration declared these Islamic Revolutionary Guards to be terrorists, even though they're on the battlefield every day in Syria fighting against ISIS, right? And they were so key in defeating ISIS in Syria. Even though, the Revolutionary Guards, have done a lot to stop terrorism in Iraq and in other parts of the world. They're effective in fighting against terrorism. They're trying to unify Muslims, so that there's not a big Sunni-Shia divide. But Trump has declared them to be terrorists. That is really a shame. And like I said, the level of development, people, you would get the impression that Iran is just a big desert, right? That's what you would think if you saw American media. Nothing could be further from the truth. The amount of bridges and, they've brought electricity to the whole country, even the rural countryside, they're all electrified. They've all got running water. They have modern computers there. They've got, people, they've all got cell phones. It's a very modern country. And it's not what you would think. It really isn't. And I mean they have, and in some ways, in terms of human rights, they're far ahead of most of the countries in the region. For example, in Iran, they not only do women vote, not only do women drive cars in Iran, but they actually have women who are brigadier generals in the military. They have a woman who is a brigadier general in the Iranian military. They have a very high percentage of women in the parliament. In Iran, for example. Iran has different political parties that run against each other. They have a constitution. They have laws. They're not a monarchy. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. The king has absolute power. People are subjects, right? There you go. I mean, Iran is fairly modern. I talk about going to church in Iran, right? I talked about how in Iran, not only did I see Christianity, and I attended Armenian Christian church on Sunday morning, but in addition to that, I saw a synagogue in Iran, and there are Jews in Iran. There are actually Jewish members of parliament in Iran. Furthermore, I saw Zoroastrians, right? That's a religion you probably never heard of, right? Zoroastrian, the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster or Zarathustra. Right? There are Iranians who worship Zarathustra and the Zoroastrianism, and there are Zoroastrian communities that predate Christianity, predate Islam, go back thousands of years worshiping this ancient prophet Zoroaster or Zarathustra. That's fascinating, right? The symbol of Zoroastrianism, it's that eagle, Ahura Mazda. It's an interesting fact that in Iran you have this very ancient faith that is still being practiced. So, this idea, the idea that we could be aligned with Saudi Arabia, right, and then condemn Iran for human rights, that's pure hypocrisy. That's just pure hypocrisy. Saudi Arabia cuts people's heads off in public. In some cases, they even crucify the bodies of people after they kill them. I mean, that's just ridiculous. The idea, I mean, Saudi Arabia, this is a country that tortures people, where a very large percentage of the country are guest worker slaves. They're bombing their neighbor Yemen and creating a humanitarian crisis. They've killed thousands of people in Yemen. This notion that Iran, bad, Saudi Arabia, good, or Saudi Arabia just okay, we have to tolerate that. I mean, it's ridiculous. Iran is far more civilized, far more, level of human rights, far safer of a country, far more, civil and modern than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is it is a primitive autocracy that has been maintained by big oil companies. And it's a government, it's a political system that really went out of fashion in the 1400s. And the Arab people, of the Arabian Peninsula are enlightened people. They're not savages. They're not primitive people. And they have a whole history of democracy and progressive thinking and reform. The only reason that Saudi Arabia exists in that primitive, barbaric political model is because Western corporations and Wall Street bankers and London bankers are imposing that on the people of that region. The Arab people are brilliant people with history of scholarship. The Islamic awakening or the Islamic Enlightenment predates the Renaissance in Europe. Right? When Europe was still in the Dark Ages, you had the Islamic Enlightenment going on, right? So this idea that somehow Saudi Arabia, that's just their culture, right? That's just the way they are. No, it's not, actually. It is not just the way people in that region are. That's imposed, right? If you look at what, was made clear in Syria and Iraq with the Ba'athist revolutions, the Arab people in Egypt with Abdel Nasser, the Arab people have a very progressive side to them, a very scholarly side. I mean, this notion that Saudi Arabia represents what the Arab people want, that's pure Western racism, if there ever was such a thing. And I'm deeply concerned about the situation with the Straits of Hormuz, right? People have wondered if Trump is trying to deflect from political scandals in the West and in his home country, trying to distract from all of that by escalating a conflict with Iran. Other people have noticed that he flopped. He flopped in Venezuela. That the attempted coup to bring Juan Guaido to power completely flopped and failed, and that it may be that the Trump administration is trying to redirect everyone's attention to the other side of the world to distract from the fact that their attempted coup against Maduro completely failed, and they weren't able to reduce Venezuela to civil war and chaos. Maybe that's the issue. But regardless, we're seeing some very provocative moves by the United States. I mean, and that's really what's happening, and we should all be very concerned about it. I mean, the amount of time I spent in Iran, I mean, I had very much an awakening in Iran. It was very key to me developing and becoming who I am today. I'm not a Muslim. I am a Christian. I never converted to Islam or anything like that. But Iran really educated me. And we might get into some of that later in the live. I have a lot to say today. I have a lot to talk about with folks. So there you go. I wanted to mention something else. Now, I saw that George Galloway is getting a lot of flack for the fact that he appeared on stage with Steve Bannon, debated Steve Bannon. There's a photo of the two of them shaking hands, and it's all this, how dare George Galloway do this? Here's the thing. I think that's a very good thing. For Steve Bannon's ideas to be countered by George Galloway's is very good. And I think that the fact that George Galloway is able to, put out his ideas in the same forum where Steve Bannon puts out his ideas, so that Steve Bannon's ideas don't go unanswered, so that both sides are represented, is a good thing. And it's very personal to me. When people were going after Jason Unruhe for debating Richard Spencer, when people now are going after George Galloway for being in the same place and debating against the ideas of Steve Bannon, they don't get it. I have no regrets about the fact that I had a public debate with Augustus Sol Invictus, right? Augustus Sol Invictus, bizarre creature. He was, eventually a month after our debate, he went on to be one of the keynote speakers at the Charlottesville event, which resulted in death and was just a horrendous occurrence where people died fighting in the streets. But I didn't engage him violently. I engaged him with ideas. And the film of our debate, was put on the internet. And it was actually widely circulated. And Julian Assange, who is now, in Britain in jail, he tweeted out the debate. He was so moved by our debate. Now, it was the first time I'd ever staged an event of that capacity. And I will say I was working without a producer. I produced the whole event myself. I arranged for Invictus and his people to come. I arranged for the room. I arranged for the camera. I kind of overwhelmed myself. And the amount of money I spent in order to pull that debate off was not small. The amount of time and energy I put into it was not small either. And a number of people have watched that debate and said, Caleb, I watched that debate, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that don't agree with me politically, all that. And they've said, Caleb, I watched that debate between you and this white supremacist, Augustus Invictus. I know what you believe, Caleb. You articulated yourself very, very clearly. I know what you believe. Understand your beliefs. You made a very articulate argument in favor of them. That guy, I have no clue what he is about. And if you watch it, watch him. All I did, there's a saying, they say, if you give certain people enough rope, they'll hang themselves, right? Invictus, he had equal time with me. He was free to say whatever he wanted. And the more you listen to Invictus in that debate, the more you realize that he's not about anything. What are the big lines that Invictus pulled off in that debate? What was his big, brilliant talking point was, if you get robbed, it's your fault because you don't have a gun. I would not agree with that. I think robbery is not acceptable, whether the person is armed or not. So I disagree with him there. I think that that robbery, whether the victim is armed or not, is not acceptable. He talked about Confederate monuments. He talked about an ex-girlfriend he had who was from Serbia. You can watch the whole thing. It's all up there online. It's pretty long too. And we had this debate, and that's the thing. You put these guys out there, they don't have much going for them. They're not really about ideas. The most shocking part of the debate was towards the end when Invictus said that he believed, that politics was about violence and killing, and that was extreme because I have been very outspoken about the fact that genuine Marxists do not favor violent revolution. The genuine Marxists favor a peaceful transition to socialism. Now, the capitalists don't necessarily allow that, and we have to understand that the ruling class can be very violent in holding back progressive social reforms. But genuine Marxists, not ultra-left adventurers, genuine Marxists have always favored a peaceful transition to socialism, and reject ultra-leftism and adventurism and the glorification of violence, the advocacy of violence, violence, the belief that violence is somehow good. That's not working class. It's not Marxist. In fact, the working class people, unfortunately, have far more violence in their everyday lives than people in the middle class or the upper classes. And they are the ones that get sent off to fight in wars. And the working class favors peace, and it favors democracy, and it becomes violent only when it has really no choice. And the revolutions of history, like the Chinese Revolution or the Russian Revolution, they were the result of the working class having no choice, of being up against a wall, of fighting for its life. It was a kill or be killed situation. And yes, in a kill or be killed situation, people do, take up the gun and defend themselves. But that is not something that Marxists glorify or celebrate, and Marxists overwhelmingly would prefer, genuine Marxists would prefer that such a thing never happen. They favor a peaceful transition. But regardless, that's not the position of Augustus Sol Invictus. Augustus Sol Invictus, he was pretty clear that he advocates violence if you watch the debate. I mean, watch it for yourself. Make your own decision. But I had that debate with him, and people watched it. And when I went to Berkeley a couple months later, people shook my hand and they said, "Good job." All kinds of people watched that debate and commented on it. Max Blumenthal watched that debate, commented on it, shared it, made a blurb about it. Other people watched it. I know it was widely watched in leftist circles. And the people who condemned me for it said, "Oh, you shouldn't engage the right wing. You shouldn't engage them." And they're kind of missing the point, which is those ideas, those right-wing ideas that are incoherent, as you can see in that film, are very widespread, and they're growing. And if you don't argue against them, or worse, if only liberals argue against them, they'll never get refuted, right? That Marxists and those of us who understand socialism, we can refute those ideas. Liberals cannot, right? Defense of the status quo against those ideas is going to set them up for victory. And that's what people don't get, that if the only response to the far right is a defense of the status quo, the far right is going to win. And that socialists should engage with those kind of people. In fact, it's better when socialists engage with them than with liberals. Now, that said, I got widely condemned and, for doing this debate. And some of the people who condemned me, it was very interesting. They tried to make it sound like it was this highfalutin, that's right, we never engage the right wing. We just have rallies around whatever is the trendy liberal cause is. We get a permit, we set up a sound system, and we have rallies, and we're better than you, Caleb. And the reason that they're not engaging the right wing, it has nothing to do with them being morally superior, it being a matter of principle. It's because they don't like ideology. They don't believe in ideas. On the left, there is a big curse of movementism nowadays. Movementism. This idea that it doesn't matter, right? Marx, Lenin, ideology, capitalism, imperialism, who cares about all of that? What matters is the movement, right? And it's all about postmodernism. It's all about, white privilege. It's all about, the movement. We're all just going to go out and protest, and that ideas don't matter. That is what's being put out by a number of, fake left organizations nowadays. And that's also what's being pushed on the campuses. And those ideas are being, that notion that theory and history and facts don't matter. That's very, very dangerous. And, a lot of people are listening to the right wing and hearing their arguments, and they're not hearing any arguments from the left. There need to be left-wing ideas to challenge the ideas of the right, okay? And I think by doing that debate, which was quite an overwhelmingly stressful experience for me, okay? I don't want to comment too much about, but, the people that he brought with him are not the kind of people I'd like to spend my Saturday afternoon with. Let me put it that way. And I got all kinds of messages from Antifa wanting me to leak the location to them. Of course, I'm not going to do that. I want to have my debate. I don't want to, end up going to jail in an orgy of violence or something, right? So I'm getting messages from Antifa. I got messages telling me that I was now a fascist collaborator. I got all kinds of hate for staging that debate. But lo and behold, and that debate's out there. You can watch it. It's still on YouTube, and it is a response. It is a debate engaging with the right. And you will see that the right has nothing, and that socialism has something. People watched it. They said, "Caleb, I know what you believe. I have no clue what that guy believes," right? So there you go. I mean, and I will do it again. I will happily debate people on the right. I have no problem debating people on the right, right? Now, I don't always have the time. I don't always have the ability, and that doesn't mean I'm going to respond to every single request I get, because my time is valuable and I've got a lot of different things there. But there is nothing wrong with engaging with right-wing ideas. There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. And not doing it, and allowing those ideas to be unanswered is the best gift that they could ever have. You know, when these right-wing guys get up there, the reason that Invictus was so bad when I debated him is because he never has to speak. When he goes out someplace, the left show up in their black masks and the police are called and he's the center of attention and he throws 2 or 3, talking points out there and the media focuses on him and the left are anonymous people in black masks and he gets free publicity and he never has to respond. He never has to really engage. In my situation, he didn't get to do that. He got called on the carpet. I asked him questions he couldn't answer. Right? If the ideas of the right are just allowed to just be out there and they get to look at us, we're victims, and then they get the free advertising, there's a difference, okay? If you look at the Battle of Cable Street, that was an event that very famously took place in 1936 in London, and that was when Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, wanted to have a parade through a Jewish neighborhood. And, at that time, there was violent, on a daily basis in Britain at that point, the Communist Party and the black shirt, British Union of Fascists, black shirts were fighting each other. And communists would, have events and black shirts would show up and beat them up. And so, so to have a march through a Jewish neighborhood in London was a provocation. It was basically, he was provoking. The way it was seen by the community was that this was inviting violence and terror. And so the British Communist Party and a lot of different people came together, and it was Jewish, Christian, white, black, Indian, all kinds of people from all kinds of different nationalities gathered in Cable Street. And said, "You shall not pass." And they blocked the march. The march didn't happen. And it was very famous, the Battle of Cable Street. And it was kind of a historic moment. They said, "You shall not pass." I'm not opposed to that, right? I think for the people in that neighborhood and people from other neighborhoods, other nationalities, to come together and defend their neighborhood from somebody who was provoking violence against their neighborhood. That's different. That is very different than somebody someplace getting up and saying right-wing things and people showing up in black masks and beating them up. That's a totally different situation. And that's the problem, right? Is that if you project the Battle of Cable Street on the situation we're in today, you're missing the point, right? That this is not 1936. There's not an armed band on the street assassinating people and gradually, on the verge of taking power, right? That this is a situation where right-wing ideas are blossoming. And so are left-wing ideas. Left-wing ideas are blossoming as well, but right-wing ideas are blossoming in response to the crisis of capitalism and the decline in the standard of living in the West. We're seeing a rise in right-wing ideas. So, as a result, we're also seeing a rise in left-wing ideas. But at this point, it's an ideological question, right? There's not violence and killing every day on the streets, and so at this point, the appropriate response to these ideas is to engage them. And to engage them in a way that doesn't strengthen the establishment, right? You need, a lot of these people that are radicalized and right-wing have never been exposed to left-wing ideas. And I think a lot of the people that are confused by the right-wing would come and be left if they had an honest representation of leftism. And that gets me to another point. Or maybe it doesn't. I know a lot of people are joining us. Shout out to all of you who are joining us. It's a lovely Saturday. So much left to discuss. The day is young, as they say. I'm having a great time, and so are you. I'm wearing my flowery shirt here, and there's so much we can discuss. Shout out to Jenny Lynn, who's joining us. I'm drinking so much more diet. Someone's asking me if I watched Jason Ruhe's reply to me about third worldism, and I did, and I'm glad he did it. I think the polemic is a big part of the Marxist tradition, and that people should, always be, be happy to, engage. And I'm glad he did it. And actually, I say to this, if why limit it to just Jason? If you are watching this right now and you don't agree with something I said, make a video. Respond to me. I think that's great. I think people should feel free to do that. If you don't agree with something I said, go make a video of yourself, Caleb Maupin responding to me. I think that's a great idea. I'm glad Jason did that. Obviously, I don't agree with him. He doesn't agree with me. But hey, I'm not offended by it. And I think we need to get past this idea that disagreeing with somebody, especially disagreeing with another Marxist, is like fighting words, right? It's like, oh my God, he disagrees with me about Lenin and the theory of the new. Come on, we don't need to be that way, right? We don't need to be that way. I think differently than Jason does. Jason thinks differently than I do. I said my piece. He said his piece. Someone's asking me to respond. No, I'm not going to turn this into a big, long thing. I said what I think. He says what he thinks. I would be open to engaging with him pretty soon. I'm on the verge of finishing the final stages of the new book, folks. The new book is on its way. The new book, right? It is in its final stages. I am going over it, and it'll be available pretty soon. And hey, folks, you're going to love this book. I just got to say that. You are going to love the new book. If you like anything I've done before, you'll love this. It's not exactly like what I've done before. It's better. I'm taking things in a direction I haven't taken things before. And I don't want to say too much about it. I don't want to give it away. But you're going to love the new book. I think you will love the new book. It's going to be something very, very exciting. So, and after the new book comes out, maybe Jason and I, we want to do a live and I'll talk further about third worldism. I'd be okay with that. That'd be fine. I like Jason. I think he's a great guy. I love what he does. And maybe somebody else would like to, engage with me. I'm open to engaging with people. I really am. I think people should engage. I'm all for that. But I'm also finishing the book. So let me finish the book, okay? Give it a week or so, right? I mean, we're in the final stages here, but, you want everything to be perfect when it comes out. I think those of you who like my work should be very, very, very excited by all of this. But what else is new, folks? Now, there's a couple things I wanted to talk about. I talked about Iran. I talked about seeing the supreme leader in Iran. But there's a lot of things I could talk about today. You reflect. I think about where I was in 2008. All right, 2008 was the year that Obama was elected president. He didn't take office till 2009. But in 2008, I spent my summer in Detroit. I was a college student, and I had an internship with an organization in Detroit that fought against home foreclosures and evictions. And it was involved with some Marxist political groups also. They were involved in this organization that I had an internship with. And, I will say that to be in Detroit in 2008, I was there fighting against home foreclosures as we were getting ready to see the fallout of the capitalist economy because the housing bubble burst. And I saw some things that just, it was very educational for me. I learned a lot that summer. And so the people I was working with in Detroit, they may not agree with me now, and that's okay. Like I said, you're allowed to disagree with me, but, they are great folks. They're people that have been in that city for years. They've been organizing and recruiting people and running for office. There's some of the best and most skilled organizers I've ever met. I was educated by these people. They taught me a lot. They engaged with me. They were patient with me. When I made mistakes, they forgave me for making those mistakes, but helped me to learn to do better. Good folks. But, I had some experiences. There were whole neighborhoods in Detroit at that point, and still are, that are just empty, just dotted, empty. Not every home for blocks has been foreclosed, has boards over the windows. That was pretty eerie. In addition to that, in Detroit, I remember there was, our office was in a church that was in downtown Detroit. The office of the home foreclosure organization I had my internship with, the office, and then there was also the office of the Welfare Rights Union. And I remember one day we got a phone call from a woman who was being kicked out of her home. What happened? Well, knock on her door one day, the sheriff shows up. You got to be out by noon. What had happened? Well, she was renting. It was an apartment. This is a woman with kids, a single mom. She was renting. Lo and behold, the landlord had not told her that he'd been foreclosed on. So the landlord didn't own the building anymore, but he just kept collecting her rent check. right? And so this single mom with kids is like panicking. What am I going to do? So she calls us, the Welfare Rights Union, and the home foreclosure organization. We bring 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people there to try and reason with the sheriffs. And there's people from the Detroit Sheriff's Department there, women sheriff deputies, and and men, and they got their guns there. And they're, what's the issue? It was kind of a standoff. But we were able to make some phone calls, get a judge to step in, and she got like a couple weeks to get out of her place. Thank goodness she didn't lose all her property. It was going to be thrown out on the street. That was an experience. I remember there was a woman by the name of Ruby Curl Pinkins, and this was an older woman, and she was going to lose her home. She and all the people in her neighborhood, they had hired an attorney to work with her case to try and stop the home foreclosure. They lost in court. And so then, she called up her church and her residents, people in her neighborhood, and her grandkids, and all the socialists and leftists came out. There was about 200 people out in front of her house. We were chanting, "Stop the eviction of Ruby Curl Pinkins! Stop the eviction of Ruby Curl Pinkins!" And we actually were able to stop her from being evicted from her home. We got a judge to sign an order allowing her to stay in her home because we got people out there and we mobilized the community. Her church was involved, the trade unions were involved, and it was a community struggle, and we were actually able to save this woman's home. That was pretty big. What else happened in Detroit that summer? I know there's a lot of outrage about the fact that in Detroit, in this neighborhood, they had an incinerator where they would burn the trash. And as a result, all these people in this low-income African-American neighborhood that had this trash burning thing in the middle of the neighborhood were all getting, breathing in pollution all day long. All these kids were breathing in pollution and had high rates of asthma. Why? Because they had this big, giant incinerator that was burning trash in the middle of their neighborhood. And they were furious. They wanted it to go away. And that was a big community struggle that went on. There was a lot of basic community struggles going on in Detroit. And being there in the middle of, and then ultimately the big struggle, the homes being foreclosed, the predatory mortgage lending. Ultimately, that big struggle, the predatory loans, the housing bubble bursting, where the predatory mortgage loans didn't work anymore, and people just stopped buying houses, and homes were being foreclosed. That's ultimately what preceded the great financial crash, right? And the financial meltdown, 2008, 2009. And I was there in the middle of it, and that was a good experience. And I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. I learned a lot. I was engaging politics. I was reading a lot during that time, reading a lot of theory. And at the same time, I was in the middle of a struggle, and it was good. And, I'm not an activist anymore. I don't do activism. I do my journalism. I do my writing. And I report on world events as they happen. I'm not an activist. I'm not involved in any political party or any political organization. But that was very meaningful to be part of those experiences. And I think my understanding of politics greatly expanded by being there in Detroit in 2008. And I wanted to reflect on that. And that, that communism, the way we understand it in the West, people see it as kind of an intellectual thing, right? This is an intellectual idea, and they don't really get it, right? The strength of the Communist Party. The strength of the Communist Party USA was struggles like that. Community struggles, taking care of people, feeding people. When I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013, and I met with communists from Angola, and I met with communists from Vietnam, and I met with communists from India. And I realized at that point that the kind of communism that exists all over the world, where you have serious mass communist parties, is very, very different than the kind of communism we have in the West. In the West, communism is among college students. It's people that are, very, very individualist and liberal-minded, feel like they don't fit in with society. They want to fight the system, and they, whereas in these other countries, these communist parties are formed out of necessity, and they're mass organizations that fight for communities and constituencies. It's very different, but that was what the Communist Party USA was in its heyday, and that's what the Black Panthers were in their heyday. And the idea that leftism could become something different, I think, is in a lot of people's minds right now. Getting out of this postmodern synthetic campus left and building some kind of community organization that could actually care for people and provide services. I think that's something that a lot of people are thinking about right now. It's on the minds of many, many people. And I wanted to mention, I remember when I was in Cleveland, I knew a lot of like older communists. And there was one particular fellow, but I mean, he wasn't the only one. I met a couple, and they would always talk about the author of this book. This is Working Class USA, The Power and the Movement by Gus Hall. And Gus Hall, from Ohio, from Niles, Ohio, which is a suburb of Youngstown, Gus Hall was the leader of the Communist Party USA in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was kind of the face of American communism during the Cold War. Gus Hall, right? He was after William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Gus Hall was later. And Gus Hall, he was from Ohio, and the thing about Gus Hall that I think is particularly interesting is that, when this older guy that I knew would talk about him, sometimes he would start crying. He'd grown up in the Communist Party in the 50s during the witch hunts, was when he was a kid. And he referred to Gus Hall as Uncle Gus. He said, my Uncle Gus, my Uncle Gus. And he would talk about his Uncle Gus, and he would tell us stories about and they were not blood relatives at all, mind you. But he would talk about kind of the legend of Gus Hall. And when you listened to this older guy talk about the legend of Gus Hall, about his Uncle Gus, you got an understanding of the reason that Gus Hall was so loved was because he reminded people of the 1930s. I mean, Gus Hall was a young man during the 1930s. He was actually imprisoned at one point. He was a steel worker in Youngstown, Ohio during the late 1930s. And very famously, during the Little Steel Strike of 1939, Gus Hall and the United Steelworkers Union had set up a picket line in front of this steel plant there in Youngstown, Ohio. They weren't letting any scab workers into the plant, and it was tough. So then they started flying the scabs over the picket line with airplanes. Right? So that's how intense it was. The company, in order to keep making steel as these workers are out there on the picket line, not letting anyone cross, right? Militant steel workers. As that's happening, lo and behold, the company starts flying replacement workers in with airplanes. So Gus Hall, and he brags about it. I mean, he didn't do it himself, but he talks about it, and he talks about it in this book, Working Class USA. Gus Hall and a few of their union buddies, they ended up shooting down an airplane. Right? Shooting down an airplane. They took hunting rifles, and they shot down airplanes. You can read about this. Look it up. It happened in Youngstown, Ohio. Steelworkers shot down airplanes in order to win their union rights. That's heavy. Right? That's some history you're not going to get in school, but it happened, right? And the class struggle in the United States is very militant. Gus Hall went to jail. He had a prison sentence at one point because he and some other people, they were accused of apparently that there was a bridge that replacement scabs were being driven over, and they were talking about destroying this bridge. Allegedly, they were discussing it. Right? That's how militant the labor unions were back in the late 1930s. There was this level of militancy. And organized labor that was very extreme. These people were fighting for their livelihoods and their jobs, and they weren't afraid to get rough, right? The company brought in the National Guard to shoot them down. They had company thugs who assassinated workers. Well, they were tough, right? And Gus Hall reminded people of that kind of militancy, and that was Gus Hall. And, one interesting thing about Gus Hall is I think is fascinating is that, and obviously, Gus Hall, he was fired eventually during the 1950s. He couldn't be a steel worker anymore. So he worked at a gas station in Niles, Ohio. He was a gas station attendant. But every week, when he was a gas station attendant, as the leader of the Communist Party of Ohio, Gus Hall would give a weekly radio address. Right? They would buy time on a statewide radio station. And they would say, "We are now bringing you a message from paid message from Gus Hall, the leader of the Communist Party of Ohio." And Gus Hall would make a radio speech that they paid for out of their dues money every Saturday. Right? And eventually Gus Hall was put in federal prison for being a communist. I mean, it's kind of an amazing story. And, Gus Hall, you can watch some interviews with him in the 80s, some of his presidential campaigns after he got out of prison. And people will say he wasn't the best, orator out there, but he'd been through it. I mean, and he went to federal prison for a long time. And he was a tough militant. He was a union militant, and he reminded people of the 1930s. And when I knew these older communists in Cleveland, they would talk about him like they were talking about, like Dr. Martin Luther King or something. They would say, Uncle Gus, Gus, Uncle Gus. And they held him kind of in reverence because they understood this was a man who'd fought for their lives and fought for their communities. If you read about the stuff that people went through back in those days, it's pretty intense. For example, Henry Winston was an African-American man who was a leader of the Communist Party USA, along with Gus Hall. He was on the national board, and he went to federal prison at the time in the late 1948 when they were sending all the communist leaders to prison. And in prison, they didn't give him adequate food. And as a result, he ended up with improper food, with not getting the medical treatment he needed. He ended up losing his eyesight. He went blind, right? Henry Winston went blind in federal prison. He was in federal prison for being a communist. He was in there for 4 or 5 years, but they took his eyesight from him. Just a horrendous thing. If you think about the sacrifices that the Communist Party USA went through and the people that maintained that organization, it goes to show you, during the late 1930s, right? The second term of President Roosevelt up until the end of World War II, being a communist in the USA wasn't a big deal. Right? I've referred to the Roosevelt administration as being far left, and I stand by that. They were far left. They were bad in a lot of ways, but for their time, and even for today in terms of economics, they were far left. They were a far left administration, probably the most left-wing presidency we've had in the last 100 years, probably, right? And the Communist Party USA was part of the Roosevelt movement. And, a lot of people were aligned with the Communist Party. If you want to get a sense of that, you should watch some Hollywood movies. Right? You can see how powerful the Communist Party USA was by watching some old movies. Watch the movie The North Star by Lillian Hellman, right? It was a Hollywood movie, The North Star. It's a musical. A Hollywood musical written by Lillian Hellman, card-carrying member of the Communist Party. In fact, she was a Broadway playwright and wrote the first play ever championing gay rights. Her name, it was called The Children's Hour. But she wrote this movie. She wrote the screenplay for this movie called The North Star. And this was a Hollywood movie, a straight-up Hollywood movie, 1942. It is communist propaganda, if there ever was any such a thing. You watch it, right? It's about a village in Ukraine. The Nazis invade, and they go and fight for their village, and it's kind of hokey. The first 15, 20 minutes of it are kind of like, what is this? Am I watching like a Soviet version of Leave It to Beaver or something? But once the Nazis invade, that movie gets very, very exciting. And it's this Ukrainian village, and they're forming underground militias, and they're resisting, and they're playing the Internationale, and the hero is a doctor who's got a Stalin mustache, and it's not subtle at all. It's a great movie. It's fun to watch. Like I said, the first 15, 20 minutes are a little bit hokey, but after that, it's pretty exciting. Watch, for example, the Battle of Russia. Now, the U.S. Armed Forces made a series of movies called Why We Fight during the Second World War. It was shown to all the members of the armed services to explain why they were fighting. Watch the one that they made called The Battle of Russia, right? It's quite exciting. Watch Mission to Moscow. If you ever get a chance, watch Mission to Moscow. That's a great movie as well. And you'll get a feeling for how popular and how widely accepted the Communist Party USA was. These were mainstream movies that were shown in movie theaters all across the country. And they were basically pro-communist movies, right? No one had an issue with it. Now, someone's asking me about Ken Loach, and actually, I will address that. At risk of offending somebody. I'm going to address the Ken Loach issue. Just give me a second here. But yeah, to be a communist in the late 30s up into World War II was a very trendy thing, right? In Hollywood, on Broadway, on university campuses, joining the Communist Party meant you were against fascism, meant you thought the Soviet Union was exciting, was doing good things, meant you were pro-Roosevelt. It wasn't that big of a deal. When 1946 happened, when the Cold War began, all the people that thought being a communist wasn't a big deal and had joined because it was something trendy, they were out of there, right? They were out of there, right? And the Communist Party, those who stayed in it, they were the ones that really believed in it, right? They were the ones who went to federal prison. They were the ones who went into hiding and hid their names. You can read some of these memoirs. It's powerful stuff. The people who stayed in the Communist Party, those folks were serious. And that's why Gus Hall, who got out of federal prison, spent longer than federal prison than any of the other ones because he tried to flee to Mexico. Gus Hall got out of federal prison, and to these people, he was like a saint. Gus Hall was, he was Uncle Gus. That they tell the story of somebody got out of prison, when Gus Hall got out of prison, and he was out of prison, and he was walking around, going around the country speaking on one of his election campaigns. Somebody came up to him, an old friend, and they were in tears, and they said, Gus, I burned my party card. I got scared. I didn't want to go to jail. I burned my party card. I stopped being loyal to the party, and I feel ashamed of it. And Uncle Gus, as I was told in this anecdote, hugged him and said, it's okay. You did what you could do. I did what I could do, but we're both comrades. Stories like that you would hear from these older communists. They were talking about somebody. It was almost like he represented. Gus Hall was what they had made all those sacrifices for, right? Gus Hall was the kind of incarnation of what they had stayed true to. And he was somebody who had been a militant, built the Steelworkers Union in the 1930s, and he was something to be reckoned with. And he was kind of sacred to them. Talk about U.S. history and all that. The communists had summer camps back in the day. Camp Wochika, which stood for Worker Children's Camp. Camp Wochika in upstate New York, where communists would send their kids from all over the country. And the Young Pioneers Club for junior high school students. And, there was a whole history of that. Now, I've got plenty to talk about here, but I wanted to mention, someone's asking me about Ken Loach, okay? Now, I've seen a few of Ken Loach's movies, all right? And I am not here to assess his entire career. Never met Ken Loach. He's a skilled filmmaker. I'll give him that. However, and someone asks, is Ken Loach a liberal? No, Ken Loach is not a liberal. Ken Loach is a Trotskyist. He's a Trotskyist. I believe he's in one of the Trotskyist factions in Britain. I don't remember which one. But the reason that I don't enjoy watching his films, and if he ever asks me, I'll tell him that, right? And I'm not critiquing his filmmaking ability, right? That's not what I'm doing here. I'm on no grounds. I've got no grounds to do that. I'm not a film scholar. I don't like his films. And the reason that I don't like Ken Loach's films is because they leave you sick to your stomach, right? Land and Freedom, right? You can argue about Spain. What's the plot of Land and Freedom? Peasants in a village rise up. It's beautiful, whatever, and then it gets betrayed, the communists sell it out, and it's all defeated. Or you can, watch his movie, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which, well-made film, won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, well-made film, but again, what is it about? Well, the Irish people rise up, they take control of their city, and they get sold out, and his films don't make you inspired. They don't make you want to go out and change the world. They don't make you excited about social progress. They leave you in this kind of sick-to-your-stomach place where everyone's a phony, everyone's a sellout, everyone's a traitor, the world is hopeless. They're very dark and pessimistic films. His films tends to be about evil things are going on, people are being oppressed. Then it gets hopeful, people are rising up, but then the revolutionaries betray the revolution, they sell out the revolution, and it's all hopeless. That's how you feel. After watching a Ken Loach movie, you feel awful. And I think that's why he gets financed to make them. If he was making films that made people inspired to go out and build socialism, and then they wouldn't pay for those movies to be made. That's why the movies get made. That's why they get financed, right? It's got that kind of pessimistic, postmodernist, there is no hope. And, if you want to see, compare the films of Ken Loach to the films of Sergei Eisenstein. Watch The Battleship Potemkin and watch October, right? Those movies, and see, don't pay attention to the cinematography of it. How do you feel at the end of the movie, right? Ken Loach movies, you feel, ugh, right? Eisenstein movies, you feel very happy, you feel very inspired. And that's my critique of a lot of leftist material. I feel like there's a lot of leftist stuff out there that just leaves you feeling rotten. That doesn't inspire you. What's the point of making it then? People know the world's awful. Everybody knows that the world is awful, right? The world has a lot of injustice in it. You don't need to remind people of that. If you're going to talk about socialism, you ought to be doing it in a hopeful, positive way. I mean, think about what is the Internationale, right? The Internationale, the theme song of the global socialist movement, going back to the 1870s, the Paris Commune. 'Tis the final conflict, let all stand in their place. The international working class shall be the human race. 'Tis the final conflict, let all stand in their place. The international working class shall be the human race. Why are they singing that, right? I mean, why isn't the song, oh, the world is awful? That's not, the point is that it's the final conflict. Let all stand in their place. The international, I mean, it's offering a hopeful, optimistic message. Socialism is ultimately about hope and progress. It has a critique of the existing world as it is, but it's, what is it? Karl Marx said that philosophers have only analyzed the world, but the point, however, is to change it, right? And that's what's missing. And I feel like that's missing from a lot of left-wing material. There is no hope. There is no optimism. There's just this kind of, critique. And Ken Loach, he's one of those people that makes films that, from a socialist perspective, that make you want to puke. I mean, I'm just being honest here. I think he's a skilled filmmaker, but I don't feel excited about socialism after watching his films. So there you go. There you go. Now. I'm sure I stepped on somebody's toes there. Somebody who's not happy that I said that. I'm sorry. I mean, that's how I feel. Maybe you like. I mean, and I'm not even disagreeing. I mean, the politics and wind that shake the barley about the Irish Free State and all of that, that's totally, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. The politics, land and freedom, I've got questions about because I don't buy the Trotskyite narrative of the Spanish Civil War, but I mean, the politics are completely correct in Land and Freedom. It's the aesthetics that I don't agree with. The aesthetics lead you to a place of demoralization, right? And aesthetics are very important. It's one point of disagreement I've had. When people are incapable of engaging with you about the politics of a movie, that's a sign that they're not very deep. Right? When you sit there and try to politically analyze a film and say, what is this film saying? And they can't engage with you. That's a sign that they're not really politically that bright. For example, Slumdog Millionaire, right? Won the Oscar. I despise that film. I despise it. Is it well made? Sure. Do you feel good afterwards? Sure. It's a happy story. What's the message of Slumdog Millionaire? I despise it politically, right? Because the message of the film is basically that India is a primitive, barbaric, third world country, but lo and behold, luckily Western capitalism is saving it from itself. It is a colonialist, neoliberal propaganda film, if ever, right? It is Ayn Rand at the movies, right? What's the premise of the movie, right? There's this very low income Indian boy who's on the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and he's answering all the questions correctly. And if you go through his life, every anecdote in his life is like a capitalist propaganda thing. Like, for example, at one point he's working at the Taj Mahal. This just shows you what the movie's about. He's working at the Taj Mahal as a tour guide. He, of course, doesn't have a license to do that, but it's like he's moving ahead. He's, working at the Taj Mahal. And, the people who run the Taj Mahal see him and they start beating him up, right? And so then, as he's being beaten up, this American couple runs over to him and saves him. And he says, now you see what the real India is all about. And then the American couple pulls a $20 bill out of their pocket and said, well, here's what the real America is all about. And gives him $20, right? There's another scene where he's standing on a construction site with his brother. And, and he looks out and there's all this construction going on. He says, I remember when this was just a village. Yes. And of course, imperialism doesn't bring development. But regardless, I remember when this was like, you get the impression the Western capitalist system is raising India out of poverty, which is the opposite, right? Or, I mean, what's the entire thing, right? The movie begins with them torturing him. Why? Because he couldn't possibly know all that, right? He's the great man, pulling himself up by his bootstraps, being punished for success. It was like the message of the film was that India is poor and impoverished and third world and socialist, basically, socialistic. But luckily, Western capitalism is saving it from its primitive, barbaric, socialistic self. That was basically the message of the film. Awful. Awful movie. Just downright awful. But so many leftists that I talked to couldn't comprehend that that was the message of the film, right? That it's the great man being tortured for success. It's, here's what the great America is all about. They couldn't get the message of the film, right? They just couldn't get it. And as far as they were concerned, I had a leftist tell me it was a progressive movie. It was a progressive movie because it showed poor people in India. It's like it doesn't occur to these people that saying that poor people exist in India is not in itself a progressive thing, right? I mean that level of that level of not getting it, and it was like, maybe you disagree with me. It was they couldn't even disagree with me. No, it's a progressive movie. It shows poor people in India. I'm like, yeah, but not everyone's a Marxist. Not everyone agrees that people are poor because no, it shows poor people in India. It must be progressive. It's that level of thinking. Not much depth. They couldn't even understand what I was saying when I was criticizing it. Another example of this kind of thinking: the movie Cold Mountain. Right? This is a movie about the Confederates, right? It's about the Confederacy. However, it's the Cold Mountain is where all these these poor low-income white people who are being drafted to fight for the Confederacy are going away. They're fleeing, right, to the Cold Mountain because they don't want to fight, right? And the whole point of the movie, if you watch it, is the Confederacy is run by the rich slaveholders, right? And these low-income Confederates are deserting, and they're running away to Cold Mountain to get away from fighting because the Confederacy is this rich slaveholders sending them to die, and they're miserable and they're being treated awful, and it shows the Confederacy as being an abomination. But I met people who insisted the movie Cold Mountain was racist. Why? Well, the heroes are Confederate soldiers. I mean, it's like, how do you argue with people like that? And you say it's showing the Confederacy is evil. No. The Confederate soldiers are bad. And if you have a movie where there's Confederate soldiers in it, it's racist. And it's like they can't understand that, like, yes, Gone with the Wind is racist propaganda. Cold Mountain is the other side of the story. It's saying that, look, the Confederacy was awful. Look how miserable these soldiers didn't want to fight. They ran away to Cold Mountain to get away from fighting for the Confederacy. They were being sent off to die for the slaveholders. It was a very progressive movie, right? And it was showing, in essence, what was wrong with, but again, when there's not depth about these things, it's a sign that somebody doesn't quite get it, right? I mean, for example, The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movie that came out just after Occupy Wall Street, right? Where the villain, Bane, is like a progressive and a socialist, right? Come on, right? I mean, that was clearly a right-wing film, right? He frees all the prisoners, and I mean, it was like, and the heroes are a bunch of cops who go in to protest a bunch of leftists and all of that. Someone's saying Bane is Bernie Sanders confirmed. Exactly, right? The left are the villains, the police are the heroes for beating up the villains, right? It couldn't get more blatant, but I've had people sit there and say, well, but it's, they don't, it's like, when people cannot understand political messages in movies, it's a point of frustration of mine. And it's not that they have to agree with me. You can disagree with me all you want, right? Someone there saying they don't agree with me about Slumdog Millionaire. Okay, but you understand what I'm saying, right? Like, as I'm saying this, you're not going, what? No, but, like, you understand what I'm saying, you just don't agree with me. When people, it's like the idea that movies might have a political message, it's like no comprendo. It's a big pet peeve of mine, right? Like, for example, I've talked about this before, right? But the movie, the Magnificent Seven, right, which was a remake of The Seven Samurai, which was itself which was then remade to be A Bug's Life, right? That was written by a kind of Marxist filmmaker in Japan, The Seven Samurai, the original one, right? And if you watch it, it's a Marxist analogy, right? So, right, I'm going to explain this without giving away. Well, if you've seen Seven Samurai, The Magnificent Seven, or A Bug's Life, basically what's happening is this, right? So you have this village, or this ant farm, or this village in Japan, or this village in Mexico, where there are these people that are poor. And there's these poor, low-income folks, and every year they get robbed by a gang of robbers, right? Or it's an ant farm, and every year they get robbed by a bunch of grasshoppers. Or it's, in Japan and Mexico. And so every year they get robbed by these robbers, right? And they're all very short in this village for some reason. Or they're ants and they're grasshoppers, right? And so they send someone to go find some heroes, some fighting guys to protect them, right? And so in Seven Samurai, they find Ronin, they're samurai that no longer work for anybody. They no longer have a master, so they're Ronin. In Magnificent Seven, they find seven kind of outlaw guys. In A Bug's Life, they find the circus or the city bugs. It's like a ladybug and stuff. Anyway, lo and behold, they find these guys to protect them from the robbers, from the grasshoppers, from the plunderers, or whatever. So lo and behold, so the guys come. Why do I say lo and behold so much? I need to drop that phrase. I'm annoyed with myself for using it. But anyway, so the guys come. The seven guys, the seven people, the seven samurai, the seven cowboys, they show up, and they're there to protect them. But the guys kind of lie about who they are. They're not who they say they are. The circus bugs, they're circus bugs. They're not fighting bugs. The samurai they're Ronin. They've all been cast out by a master, so they have a dishonorable reputation. The Magnificent Seven are outlaws. They're not actually sheriffs or something like that. It's been a while since I've seen the movie. And so the people feel betrayed. They're like, you lied to us. And so they're just downtrodden, and they feel awful. And then, of course, just like every year, the robbers ride in. The grasshoppers ride in. The people robbing them come on in. Lo and behold. And so the people are demoralized because they had all their hopes up that this year they were going to fight back and protect themselves. But they're going to be robbed. What are they going to do? It's awful. It's awful. Well, however, the people suddenly get inspired, and they fight back. And they realize that all along they didn't need the Magnificent Seven. They didn't need the circus bugs. They didn't need the Seven Samurai, right? They didn't need them all along. They could do it themselves, right? And what is it saying here? The vanguard party does not overthrow the bourgeoisie on behalf of the proletariat. It inspires the proletariat to be aware of its own strength. Right? It empowers the people. It shows the people how strong they are. The Magnificent Seven showed the people, the short Mexican villagers, that they could defeat the bandits all along, right? The Seven Samurai showed the people of the Japanese village that they could defeat the raiders and the robbers all by themselves. They didn't need it, right? The circus bugs showed the ants that they could defeat the grasshoppers all along, right? That's the message of the movie, right? It's about the role of a vanguard party. It's about how the vanguard party it pushes people to be aware of their own strength. Basic Marxist overtone. That's what it's about. That's what it's about as a movie. Now the Joker just asked me, he gave me a $10 super chat, and he asked me what my next book is about. I feel like I owe you an answer. You did throw $10 at me after all. But I have to answer it in a way that doesn't completely get rid of your anticipation, right? So yes, as folks know, I usually release a compilation of my articles every year, right? And it's just a compilation of my articles. That's not what I'm doing this year. This year, I have written a book-length essay summarizing a lot of key trends in the world today around a certain theme. And it's, the book opens with a book-length analysis of the world as it is, and certain historical trends and a lot of exciting stuff. It's a kind of a poetic essay that opens the book. And then from there, it leads you to the articles that I've written this year. Much longer than any other book I've ever put out. And it has a book-length essay at the beginning, which encompasses a lot of things, and I've done a huge amount of research in order to publish. So I haven't given away too much, but basically that's what we've got here. We've got a book in front of my articles. So there you go. And I've done a lot of research, pulled from a lot of different sources, and I come to some very interesting conclusions. And I'm not going to give away the topics or anything like that. I'm not going to give away the title or anything. You'll see it, and you'll like it. It'll knock your socks off. So there, I hope I've answered your question, Mr. Joker. I appreciate your $10 super chat. But yes, there's a book in front of a book. Let me put it that way. There's a book in front of my articles this year, centered around a certain theme. So there you go. I hope that answered your question. Now, there we go. So, what else is on people's minds? That Ken Loach guy wanted me to get back on Ken Loach. I think I answered the Ken Loach question pretty thoroughly. I don't know why you want me to get back to that. I don't know what more could be said. Someone's talking about chemical weapons attacks in Syria. Well, okay, so now we have some leaks that inside the OPCW, there was disagreement about the report they put out. There were people inside the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons who didn't agree with the report that they ultimately put out and had questions about whether or not the chemical attack was actually done by the Syrian government. Those leaks have come out, and mainstream media is not acknowledging them. Russia did their own investigation, and we know about that. And if you read the details that have come out, it pretty thoroughly, these leaked documents blow some pretty big holes in the official story. But what have I been saying all along? Because let's back up, right? All along, I have been saying what has been said by the United Nations, right? This is confirmed. Throughout this entire war, which began in 2011, throughout this entire war, the Syrian opposition, the Syrian rebels, the Syrian terrorists, the people trying to overthrow the Syrian Arab Republic, have been using chemical weapons. Right? Carla Del Ponte from the UN has confirmed that. Different international bodies have looked into it. The al-Nusra terrorists have been using chemical weapons. Right? Different factions in Syria that are trying to overthrow the Syrian government have been using chemical weapons from the beginning. So how does that, do you know what I'm saying? It just kind of gets on my nerves here, right? If we're all outraged about chemical weapons, why wasn't it front page news when people that are being supported by our tax dollars in the USA were using chemical weapons? If we are concerned about the use of chemical weapons, why is it like, oh, okay, in 2013, they accused the Syrian government of doing international outrage, time to send in the bomb. Well, the whole time, the people trying to overthrow them have been using chemical weapons, right? And there are, and these attacks that are then blamed on the Syrian government, a lot of holes, a lot of questions here, right? Not everyone just agrees with the international, with the U.S. government's assessment of that situation, right? There's a lot of disagreement internationally about the nature of these attacks. Right? And the response, if you bring that up, is people just go, oh, yeah, oh, you're in a... And they just roll it because there's no answer to it, right? I mean, if you read what critics of the official narrative have said, there are a lot of holes, and not just this one, the one in Ghouta. There's a lot of holes in a lot of these stories. And the reason that they don't engage with these holes is because, if you engage with them, they just roll their eye. You don't think he did it. Oh, you're a nut. And that's how they engage. They know how to handle it. They're not going to engage because it's just kind of like, if you don't accept their version of the events, you're a tinfoil hat and you're a loony. And that's all they've got. But read the critiques of the OPCW report. Read the critiques of the narrative around Ghouta, around Doom. There's a lot of questions to be asked. But regardless, I'm not in Syria. I'm not, that's. But even if you take everything that has been said, everyone acknowledges that the forces trying to overthrow the Syrian government, the forces that have been aided and abetted by Saudi Arabia, by the United States, by France, by Britain, have been using chemical weapons. So if we're outraged about chemical weapons, we should be out not supporting it's like, it's right there in your face. But I guess that's not news, right? It's beyond me, right? There's question. It is widely debated. There is not universal agreement on the fact that the Syrian government used chemical weapons. There's definitely not universal agreement on that. However, there is universal agreement There is absolutely universal agreement that anti-government forces in Syria have used chemical weapons. Nobody disagrees with that. The al-Nusra terrorists have used them. Other factions have used them. Chemical weapons have been used by Syrian terrorists, by not even Syrian terrorists. Terrorists in Syria trying to overthrow the Syrian government have used chemical weapons. That's a fact. Everyone confirms that. Nobody denies that. Why is there no outrage about that? Right? Why, and now there's outrage about allegations, and there's a lot of debate about what the Syrian government has done. That's widely contested. There are different views, right? There are people who say they absolutely did it, like the leaders of the United States, Britain, and France. They say they absolutely did. There are people who say they absolutely did not, right? And we know they turned over their chemical weapons in 2013, and the OPCW said that they didn't have any chemical weapons, and, we can get into all of that. But regardless, right? Regardless, okay? It's like even their narrative, even in the facts that they admit, it doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, there you go. I get fired up about this, but no one, people just, they see the headline, some dictator around the world who's against America and against our freedom is killing. I mean, it's like the whole situation there. I mean, there's no looking into the depth of it. And, if you question their narrative about what happened, well, you're an Assad apologist, and, you don't really believe that, do you? They don't want to engage with you. You're just dismissed as a nut, number one, even though, some of the biggest countries in the world, like Russia, like China, all kinds of media, I mean, all over the world, there are people that have questions about the OPCW reports and don't, and have questions about other reports that are coming out. All over the world, people don't buy it. There's a lot of people who do buy it. There's a lot of people who don't. But, if you don't go along with one version of events, you're a nut. Oh, okay, you're a nut. I mean, it's just like that's the way that the narrative is. And rather than try to actually defend their argument, when people raise objections, they just go, oh, you're an Assadist, you're an Assad apologist. It's like, what is an Assadist? The term is Ba'athist, right? It's the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. What is an Assadist? That doesn't even make any sense. But whatever, I'm going to take another drink of this soda. Oh, boy. What else is on my mind? Folks, someone's asking me about Samir Amin. Well, I read some of his writings that were published in Monthly Review magazine. I used to read that pretty religiously. I've not been keeping up with it as much lately. But I don't really have the ability to completely give a complete analysis of the figure. What I read was interesting to me, Samir Amin. I don't want to endorse him necessarily. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with him as I should be. But I read his stuff in Monthly Review back in the day. I know he died. But I also know that he was quite critical of Western imperialism, from what I understand. So there you go. I can't say too much about Samir Amin, but now you've inspired me. Now I'm going to, after this live, you can bet I'm going to go read some Samir Amin's stuff. I know he was a Marxist scholar. I think he was Egyptian. But there you go. But speaking of that, I wanted to mention that, I've made the analogy before that Barack Obama was like Napoleon, right? And as you look back at the Obama presidency, it was very much like Napoleon. Right? Napoleon, when he tried to take over Syria, when he tried to take over Egypt, what did he do? He put up posters everywhere announcing that he was a Muslim. He was not a Muslim, but he gave the illusion that he was the friend of the Arab people, right? You can read this proclamation sent out by Napoleon. And I feel like the Obama presidency was very much, a subtle way to try to send a message to the Middle East, to the Arab world, to the Muslim world, that they had a friend, that they had a pal. There was a guy who was on their side. And, I really do think that's what was happening. Can you imagine how different the Arab Spring would have turned out with Bush as president of the United States or Trump as president of the United States, right? There's no question. And that in terms of recruiting the Arab world, manipulating the events of the Arab Spring of 2011, having a president whose middle name was Hussein, who attended a Muslim school in Indonesia, that was very, very key. It was very, very key. And that really, Obama, in a lot of ways, it was like Napoleon. Napoleon faked out or tried to fake out the Arab world by claiming to be a Muslim. And it seems to me like Obama was, I mean, he wasn't claiming to be a Muslim, but there was constantly this allegation that he was a Muslim and that it was an attempt to convince the Arab world there was a guy in the White House who was more sympathetic with them, who could understand them. Like this wasn't the bad old United States. This wasn't Bush who called it a crusade. It was an attempt to kind of fake out the Arab world. And I think that the Obama presidency very much was a slick PR maneuver. It was an attempt to try and convince people in the Middle East that the United States and Western capitalism wasn't all against them, right? And that's my thinking. If you think about it, that it was also a message to the rest of the world that the USA was overcoming its racial hardships, right? That look, we elected a black president. You know, I mean, we know that during the Cold War, for example, the Soviet Union took the picture of Emmett Till. A 1954 young African American man was lynched for whistling at a white woman, just brutally torn up. I mean, his face was just. I mean, the photos of his open coffin are just horrific. The Soviet Union took that picture and sent it all over the world and said, "Look, this is the USA says it's a homeland of freedom and democracy. Yeah, this is what they did to a young African American man, a 15-year-old African American, person, for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Yeah, is that a democracy?" And it was a PR disaster, right? And then in the civil rights movement, part of the reason the Kennedy family and others started, making noise about civil rights was because they wanted to clean up the image of the United States. They wanted the USA to look more benevolent, and that the Obama presidency was the ultimate incarnation of that. Look at us, we've overcome our racial difficulties. But then what happened, right? The Obama presidency resulted in a very big escalation of racial unrest. Black Lives Matter, Trayvon Martin, right? Because the black community thought, okay, we finally have, somebody in the White House who will listen to us, and the situation got worse, not better, right? The police brutality issue escalated. I mean, and it was, we saw, kind of an escalation of these concerns because, and the Obama presidency did not resolve the issues. So I think that was interesting. But yes, there's a wing of the American establishment that is always trying to accommodate and give the image that the USA is Mr. Friendly and operate covertly. That's the intel agencies, right? They want to make the USA look like a benevolent, friendly, Mr. Nice Guy power. Whereas the Pentagon, what are they all about? Peace through strength. It doesn't matter if the rest of the world likes us as long as they're terrified of us, as long as they're afraid of being blown up, as long as we look big and strong and powerful. It doesn't matter, right? The Pentagon is all about military spending. It's all about shock and awe and the mother of all bombs and kaboom and peace through strength. Whereas the intel agencies are all about Mr. Nice Guy. We're the nice democratic United States. We never intervene in other people's countries, but people around the world fight for freedom, and they fight against regimes we don't like, and they happen to get weapons and funding and propaganda in our media to do it. But we're just nice and we're friendly, and look, we're getting over a history of racism, and our president, he might know about Islam. Yeah, I mean that's more CIA, right? CIA intel agencies have a very different way of operating than the Pentagon. And people look at throughout the Cold War, and very much the push-pull between Republicans and Democrats was in a lot of cases, are you for the Pentagon, rolling thunder, bomb them into the Stone Age, militarism, or are you for the CIA, those who make peaceful revolution impossible, make violent revolution inevitable. I am going to start the Peace Corps. John F. Kennedy, different strategies, right? The soft power CIA strategy versus the military brass, blow them up, kill them all. Those are different strategies. Those are very, very different strategies. How do you run the United States? How do you secure the profits of Western corporations? How do you make sure that Wall Street and London stay at the center of the world economy? Do you do it in a Mr. Nice Guy soft power way, or do you do it in a ruthless, blow them up, explosive, lots of military spending way? That's kind of defined the Cold War, and those are the differences that kind of define U.S. foreign policy. So there you go. There you go. Now, someone's accusing me of being a Western chauvinist. I don't know what that's about, but there you go. I'm just asking me about Modi. Modi he's a nationalist, Hindu nationalist, got a record of being very hostile to Muslims in India, but he's, nationalistic on some level. And I think that in a lot of ways, I think that Modi, you could compare him to Duterte. You could compare him to Erdogan in Turkey, and these are guys that'll talk to both sides, right? That they'll sign on with Russia and China sometimes. They'll sign on with the United States sometimes. It just depends on who's offering them a better deal. And they probably represent, wealthy people within their country, a strata within their own country that is somewhat independent, and they've been empowered. And because of the rise of Russia and China, a strata within their own country has developed that is strong enough, to negotiate. And sometimes they go with China and Russia, and sometimes they go with the United States and Britain, and they're wheeling and dealing. And that this is Bonapartism to some degree, right? And that that Bolivarianism began as a Bonapartist struggle that eventually moved towards socialism. And but and I don't think India. I mean, Modi is certainly not going to move towards socialism. That's not going to happen. Every so often, he passes some banking regulations that get him yelled at in the press. I saw Wall Street Journal just rake him over the coals for some new banking regulations at one point. So on some level, he's not trusted, just like Duterte, just like Erdogan. But on other times, they do. I mean, it's a back and forth. These are guys that represent their own strata. They represent the wealthy people of their country. They're more independent. What is unique about them is that they're more independent. You have U.S.-aligned regimes and client states. You have, anti-imperialist countries. But you got this third camp, you could call it, Modi, Erdogan, Duterte, that are somewhere in the middle, right? And they're not fully in the anti-imperialist camp, but they're not trusted by the United States. The USA would prefer they not be there. They'll do either or, right? And that's kind of my assessment. And I think that category is going to expand. That category is going to expand now as Russia and China get stronger. You're going to get a lot more leaders emerging in the developing world that are not anti-imperialist, but not clients and puppets of the West either. They're their own person. They have their own view. Erdogan is, he's a Muslim. Duterte was kind of a populist, comes out of the anti-drug vigilante groups. Modi is a Hindu nationalist. These guys are not leftists. They're not progressives. They're not socialists. Duterte kind of calls himself one. He was talking more of a left-wing game when he started, but he's backed away from that. He's not going that direction. And Erdogan and Modi never were. I mean, Modi is on the hard right in India, and Erdogan is hard right-wing and conservative in Turkey. But they're independent. So it's a push and pull. And I think that the Trump administration is desperate to keep Modi in the U.S. camp. And the same with Duterte. And they're working overtime, to try and keep those guys, because Erdogan has gotten much more friendly to Russia at this point, right? Russia and Turkey are much closer. And I think that is considered to be, something that has hurt the United States in terms of geopolitics. And so it looks to me like the Trump administration is very desperate to keep Duterte and keep Modi in the U.S. camp. And that, it used to be for years the USA was kind of neutral between India and Pakistan. Not anymore. The USA is anti-Pakistan at this point. They do not like Imran Khan. They do not like the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And they're escalating their support for Modi and for the government of India. And you'll notice that, and that's a big shift, right? The China-Pakistan economic corridor is huge. It's raising people out of poverty in Pakistan. It's big, right? The China-Pakistan economic corridor is not a joke. It is a big, big deal in geopolitics. And Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabis and the extremist jihadist forces are trying to are trying their hardest to stop what's happening with the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And because the USA is so opposed to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, they're accommodating with Modi a lot, right? India and Pakistan don't get along. The USA has tried to kind of be neutral. Now it seems like the USA is solidly against Pakistan with India, and that's a new development. Now, could that change? Of course, right? These things are not permanent. They're shifting alliances. That's long-standing reality of politics in our world today. So I think I might take a few more questions before I go. I've still got some Diet Coke. I hope I'm not up half the night. Ask me some other stuff. What else is on people's minds? What else is on people's minds? What's happening, folks? North Korea Kim. All right. Has the hope passed? Has the hope passed on the Korean Peninsula? I don't know. Has it? I don't know. I worry that, Trump, one good thing about Trump was that he met with Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-un, met with them. Um, there was the first summit in Singapore. There was the second summit in Hanoi. But there was pretty clearly some opposition within the establishment, and did the moment pass? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I don't know. I mean, I hope that the talks can be resumed, and I have a feeling, with what's going on in the Far East, Vladivostok Economic Forum, where, Putin and Xi were talking, South Korea, the railroad connections. The world is moving toward lighting up that part of the world becoming more developed than ever before. North Korea and the nuclear standoff and the sanctions and all of that is the big kind of hole. And everyone kind of wants it resolved, but how is it going to get resolved? And I have a feeling that things on the Korean Peninsula are not going to go back to like they were before. Now, we were hoping things would move very quickly. Looks like we've taken some steps back. It may be a while before it happens again. I have a feeling. My prediction is there will be more negotiations. I feel like it was going really good for a moment. It stopped. We may be taking a few steps back, but I don't think it's off. I think that what's happening in that part of the world economically right now is so important. So important. And what's happening in the Russian Far East, what's happening in China, what's happening in South Korea, all that stuff isn't going to stop. And that I feel like there will be a resumption at some point. Maybe not soon. It'll happen. I think that there will be a resumption of negotiations regarding North Korea and the nuclear program. There you go. So on that note, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Someone's asking about Iran. Well, wind it back, because I spoke a lot about Iran at the beginning. Someone's saying climate change is being hijacked by capitalists. I've talked about that before, and Malthusianism and Rockefellers and all of that. Now, there you go. What is my opinion about Brexit? Well, I'll say the same thing I've always said about Brexit, which is that Brexit, if Britain leaves the European Union, that would be a good thing. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people who voted for Brexit for not good reasons, anti-immigrant, Islamophobia, but ultimately, Britain breaking out of the EU is a good thing, right? The EU is bad for working class people. It's bad for the world, right? The European Union is not a good thing, and in my opinion, Britain breaking free from it is good. However, I know that a lot of the people that are in favor of Brexit have bad motivations. So it's complicated, right? It's a complicated situation. That said, I'll never forget a conversation I had with a certain individual who shall not be named. And if she sees this, she'll hate me even more than she already does. But, there was a certain individual that I talked to just after the Brexit vote, a certain leftist that I knew. And she asked me the same question you just asked me. What is your opinion of Brexit? And I said what I just said, which is, well, unfortunately, people voted for it for not so good reasons, but ultimately it's a progressive thing, and that the EU is not a good thing, and that, this is part of the changing political climate and disagreements within the ruling class, Bonapartism, global capitalist crisis. I mean, that just seems like a pretty standard answer. And this person went crazy in response to my answer. Oh my goodness, Caleb, how can you say that? Right, we're on the brink of fascism. It's happening here. Trump is about to get elected. Oh, when stuff gets real. And she's, she's using SHIT. When bleep gets real, Caleb, some people are going to be with us and some people are going to be against us. When bleep gets real, and it's just like, you listen to these people, it's like, stop LARPing. Please, like live action role play, LARPing. So many leftists, okay, you're not Winston. It's not 1984. You're not an action hero. Stop it. Just stop it, right? I mean, there's these apocalyptic fantasies. There's somebody on social media the other day who was trying to argue that the mass shootings are all part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. Well, here's the thing, right? Most of these mass shooters are right-wing. They're attracted to white supremacist, hateful ideology. But they're individuals, young white men, who snap and go crazy and commit mass shootings. That's what they are, right? And the idea that this is all, and they said, Google leaderless resistance. And it's like, give me a break. These people, they have their alienation, right? It's like the world is against me, and it's like their politics is an expression of some kind of weird teenage adolescent alienation or something. And it's like, oh, when it gets real, Caleb, some people are going to be with us and some are going to be against us. Oh, Lordy. Or then there was this other person who was, oh, it's leaderless resistance. They're using anarchist tactics. No, the mass shootings are not a vast conspiracy from the far right. It's a symptom of the fact that a lot of hateful, psychopathic people who commit mass shootings also are attracted to hateful right-wing ideology and white supremacists. But, and it's like they have this like doomsday scenario in their head, right? Pessimism, folks. We need to get past the pessimism. Right? They have this doomsday scenario in their head, and it's like the whole world is against me, and no one understands me, and I'm under attack, and oh, God, it just drives me crazy. And that, folks, is why, number one, there's this, like, they continue to suppress people, with who's, question the narratives around the OPCW in Syria, or are not jumping on the bandwagon of wanting to overthrow the Syrian government, or, they suppress, there's this, like, witch hunt in left-wing circles against tankies and Nazbols and all of that. Well, that's why so many leftists buy into the Russiagate nonsense, right? And they repeat the Russiagate story that, oh, Trump is working for Putin and this is a fascist plot to take, and it's that silly adolescent. It's this it's not a Marxist narrative they have. It's a liberal narrative. It's Anthem by Ayn Rand. It's 1984 by George Orwell. It's Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's the masses, the rabble are coming to take away my individuality and no one understands me. Oh, shut up, right? I mean, I've been there, right? I don't fit in with society. I have, my own views. Obviously, I'm not mainstream, but it's like, it's anti-populism. They see people as the enemy. They have a persecution fantasy, and they have fit the Trump presidency and world events into it. And if you don't go along with it, you're a Nazi. Right? And everyone's a Nazi. And you talk to these people, everyone's a Nazi. Oh, so-and-so's a Nazi. So-and-so shook hands this way, they're a Nazi. Oh, so-and-so had this, T-shirt on, they're a Nazi. So-and-so read this book, they're a Nazi. Everyone's a Nazi, and everyone's a Nazi, and there's a vast fascist conspiracy, and if you don't go along with their hysterical liberal crusade, then you're a Nazi also. It's a big problem. I'm tired of hearing that. I meet people like this, and it just, it irks me, because you can't have a rational conversation. Fear. I'll say this. Fear is not a good emotion, right? Politics based on fear is bad, right? Fight or flight is not a rational. You're not thinking rationally when you're fight or flighting. You're going, fight or flight. It's a startled, right? And when you have politics that's based on fear, on the right or on the left, it's bad. It's always bad, right? And on the right, it's, the immigrants are going to come here and rob you and kill you, so you got to put up a wall. Yes, put up the wall. I'm scared, right? And on the left, it's, oh my God, Trump is going to put us all in concentration. Okay, impeach Trump. I'm scared. When people are reacting out of fear, they're being manipulated. That is how you manipulate people. We don't need fear politics in the United States, from the right or the left. We need rational optimism. We need people saying, how do we get our country out of the rut? We need people to be like engineers. You give an engineer a problem, and they sit there and they get out their calculator and they work out possible solutions. That's what we need. We need political engineering. We need political building. We need people to think more rationally than ever before. And when it's like every political faction has their different political nightmare. Right? The Trump Nazi hysteria thing, the immigrants are coming, the Muslims are coming. Stop it. Politics based on fear is not rational. And when people start acting politically and coming up with political worldviews that are not based on, this is what I think we need to do to fix the country, but rather based on, oh my God, I'm in danger. You don't think rationally when you're in that state. When people panic, they're not thinking rationally. And the Stop Trump hysterics, which for some people it's really about some of their own issues, but for the broader milieu, it's a panic response. The anti-immigrant bigotry, the anti-Islamic, hey, it's politics of fear. We need to get over the politics of fear. We really do. Fear-based hysteria is going to bring out the worst in people, and it brings out really, really stupid, awful politics that doesn't lead to anything good, right? It's funny, Naomi Klein kind of hints at this in her book, The Shock Doctrine, where she talks about how, they use shock and startled moments to push neoliberalism, right? I think I got the book right over here. I don't agree with everything she's wrote. A lot of good statistics, a lot of good research that went into this book. And she points out about neoliberalism hijacks situations of fear and panic in order to push neoliberalism. Well, you're very well. Marie Gentz says that was great. Well, I agree. It needs to be said. It's Caleb, I agree, says Kazuya. I agree too. Obviously, I wouldn't have said it if I didn't agree. But, folks, we got to get past politics of fear. We need rational solutions. And that's what socialism is. Socialism is science applied to the economy. Socialism is the idea that the workers ought to control the means of production, that the banks, factories, and industries should be controlled by the people. We should have a planned economy. And we should organize the economy rationally in order to make a better life for people. Right? We shouldn't have the irrationality of profits and greed control society. That's what socialism is, right? Socialism is the idea that we can get to a better place when we have a rationally planned economy, when the means of production are controlled by society, not operating according to capitalist greed. That's what socialism is, right? We should control the economy. Yes, I'm deeply worried. Split Seconds is asking me about Julian Assange, and, yeah, I'm worried about that too. The Espionage Act, goodness gracious, right? He could be very seriously, this is not good. Not good at all. And it's a threat to a lot of mainstream media, right? A lot of mainstream media could face the same kind of charges, right? The implication is if you publish something and someone leaks to you, you can go to jail for it if it's classified, right? Assange was not a U.S. government employee. He's not a U.S. citizen, was not even in the United States at the time, but he's being charged with allegedly, publishing information. That's very scary. If Assange is extradited to the United States, stands trial, if this stuff, the implications it could have for all kinds of media, for all kinds of people is very, very extreme. It's one thing to arrest leakers, right? If you work for the military, it's obviously illegal for you to make classified information public. If you have a security clearance and all of that, that's one thing. But to go after publishers, right? For people publishing what was leaked to them, that's a whole nother thing, and we should all be very, very worried about it, right? They're trying very hard to cover up what they're actually doing. They want to retaliate against Julian Assange for publishing what he published with WikiLeaks. That's what's going on here. They want to punish Julian Assange for what he did with WikiLeaks. They're trying to dress it up in all kinds of fancy legal whatever, but they've been trying to do this for 7 years. They've been trying to go after Assange because they're mad at him for making public a lot of information they didn't want the world to see. That's what's going on. And that's what's happening with the Assange case. I'm deeply worried about it. And I think we should all be deeply worried about it. The implications are pretty extreme. I think it's interesting. I expected them to bring the new charges against Assange at another point. Oh, thank you, Mr. Officer. He says, good job, Caleb. Well, thank you. I think that they expected that the charges would be brought after he was extradited to the USA on the minor conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge. But now we have 17 new charges leveled against Julian Assange. We got Chelsea Manning back in federal prison after she refused to testify. Very extreme situation. I think we should all be worried about it. There you go. Someone wants to talk about Ken Loach again. Seriously, folks, wow. Maybe you should start a Ken Loach web forum or something. I said what I needed to say about it. There you go. There you go. But, I like to do these lives. I like to talk about art and culture and science. Mark Lugo says, hey, Caleb. Hey to you. But, I like to talk about these lives. The new book, you're all going to love. You will love the new book, by the way. I tried not to give away too much about it because I want it to be exciting when it comes out. I don't want everyone to know everything there is to know about it already. But it's going to be something special. And I think folks are going to love it. I really do. Give it a week or so, it'll be out, and you'll love it. So stay tuned, folks. Remember, the more you tweet and share this, the bigger the conversation is, the more you bring people into this. Share, promote, like, and make sure you're still subscribed, right? And make sure that you're getting notifications about these lives, because it's very strange. I know some people are not getting these notifications and all that. So, be sure that you're subscribed. Be sure that you stay in touch with the YouTube channel. I've been posting a lot to the YouTube channel lately. So if you follow me on Twitter and stuff, but be sure to follow the YouTube channel, because a lot of exciting stuff is happening. We're all just doing the best we can. We're a community here, you and I and all of us watching. I love you all, as I always say. I love the fans. I love the haters. I love the lurkers. You have the right to lurk. I respect your right to lurk. We're all having a good day here. We're struggling for truth, there you go. And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Got plenty to do this weekend, trying to get this book ready for publication. So, fingers crossed. I love you all. Stay